I want to thank you for tuning into this webinar on what is proliferation financing hosted by the agency. My name is Samoji Hughes. I am the outreach officer for the agency, and with me to facilitate this discussion on proliferation financing is the Deputy Director for Supervision and Enforcement, Dwayne Thomas. Now, we know that proliferation financing can be very difficult to understand. So today's webinar has been designed to focus on this topic and go through some of the basics for those persons who may be new to the DNFBP sector, or for those persons who might not be familiar with the topic. Now, this webinar will focus on covering a few key areas as it relates to proliferation financing, which includes what it is, the stages, how it differs from money laundering and terrorist financing, as well as identifying PF red flag indicators that businesses should look out for, among other things. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. Now, what is proliferation financing? Well, the basic definition of the word proliferation is something that rapidly increases in amount. For AML, CFT, CPF purposes, though, proliferation is a manufacturing, acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their means of delivery and related materials. This includes both technologies and dual-use goods used for non-legitimate purposes, in contravention of national laws, or where applicable, international obligations. It includes technology, goods, services, or expertise. I know that was a lot, so seeing that it could be a bit technical, let's break it down a bit further. Proliferation is performed when a person or a group of persons or organizations rapidly or on a larger scale make, acquire, have in their possession, develop, export, along with all the other things mentioned, nuclear weapons such as bombs, chemical weapons such as toxic gases and sprays, and biological weapons for the creation of viruses or other disease-producing agents to cause death or harm to others on a large scale. Now, proliferation also involves not just the use of these weapons, but their means of delivery and related material. This would include technologies and dual-use goods used for non-legitimate purposes. Now, when we refer to dual-use goods, we're talking about goods or items, including software and technology, that have more than one specific purpose. They're basically goods that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. For example, vehicles, pumps, and generators, among other things. Let's take a vehicle, for example. It's used to get you from point A to point B, but the parts of the vehicle can also be used to create bombs and other weapons. This is what we mean when we say dual-use goods. Proliferation also includes facilitating with the provision of software, services, and expert advice to criminals looking to use these things to cause widespread harm and destruction. Now, under BVI legislation, proliferation financing is deemed and defined to be under the Proliferation Financing Prohibition Act, which outlines that proliferation financing takes place when a person makes available an asset, provides a financial service, or conducts a financial transaction, and the person knows that or is reckless as to whether the asset, financial service, or financial transaction is intended in whole or in part to facilitate any of the following activities, which include the manufacture, production, possession, acquisition, stockpiling, storage, development, transportation, sale, supply, transfer, export, transshipment, or use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, or materials related to these nuclear, chemical, biological, or radiological weapons that are prescribed by regulations or restricted or prohibited under any enactment relating to export or import control measures, as well as the provision or technical training, advice, service, brokering, or assistance related to any of these activities. Now, as suggested, proliferation is a very broad topic and refers to more than simply the payment for goods. Proliferation financing includes any financial service provided in support of any part of the process of procurement and financing of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, even if financing is not directly connected to the physical flow of the goods. Financing can include financial transfers, mortgages, credit lines, insurance services, trust and corporate services, and company formation. So, proliferation financing is both a financial crime risk and a sanctions risk, depending on how you look at it. So we'll now go into the stages of proliferation financing, and I'll have Mr. Thomas go through that.
Good morning again, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Like money laundering and terrorist financing, proliferation financing also has 3 stages. These stages include the very first stage, fundraising, which is exactly what it says. During this stage, the proliferator raises funds for the program through its domestic budget, perhaps supplemented with funds raised by networks overseas or by criminal activity conducted by or on behalf of state actors. The second stage is disguising the funds. This is where the proliferator transfers the funds into the international financial system. If the country is not sanctioned, this stage is straightforward. For countries subject to comprehensive sanctions like North Korea and Iran, it is a greater challenge for them to do so. Last but not least, stage 3. This is the procurement of materials and technology. At this stage, the proliferator uses the funds in the international financial system to pay for goods, materials, technology, and logistics needed for its weapons of mass destruction program. Throughout the third stage, international financial institutions will be involved in processing the related transactions. Now we're going to take a look at how is proliferation financing different from money laundering and terrorist financing. The chart you see above highlights some similarities and some differences, but we're going to focus on 4 of these similarities now. So, how is PF different from ML and TF? Proliferation financing differs from money laundering and terrorist financing in a number of ways. For example, the intention of a money launderer is to clean their illegal funds for their personal use. With terrorist financing, it is to support the terrorist ideologies and activities and beliefs. However, for proliferation financiers, their main aim is to acquire goods that can contribute to the weapons of mass destruction programs without being detected, caught, or prosecuted for. Other differences include source of funds. As we see here in the chart, money launderers solely receive their funding from proceeds of crime. Whereas with terrorist financing and proliferation financing, the funds can come from both legitimate and illegitimate sources. An example as it relates to proliferation financing includes monies from a legitimate business such as charitable organizations and or government sponsors, as well as from unlawful sources such as predicate offenses including extortion, drug trafficking, kidnapping, theft, and the likes. Conduits. In this area, PF is similar to money laundering, as they both utilize the formal financial system to get their funding to its ultimate destination, while TF, terrorist financing, uses informal methods such as cash couriers, underground hawala systems, and the likes. Transaction amounts. Money laundering requires large amounts of cash, as the launderers are seeking to gain access to the funds once it's been cleaned. Proliferation financing requires a moderate amount, solely because it's used to buy, like Mr. Hughes mentioned, dual-use goods that you can walk into general hardware stores and purchase. Terrorist financing uses small amounts of cash that are usually below the reporting threshold. Next. Then, as it relates to financial activity, money launderers use a complex web of transactions involving complex company structures. Terrorist financiers utilize various products, including the formal banking system, informal value transfer systems, smuggling of cash and valuables, whilst proliferation financiers' transactions look like normal commercial activity, which are possibly structured to hide the source of funds. There are also other key differences mentioned in these slides, and further information on these can be found in the Countering Proliferation Financing Guidance Notes that has been published on the agency's website, so please go and check that out. Next, we're going to look at some of the difficulties in identifying proliferation financing. There have been a number of challenges associated with identifying proliferation financing. These include a growing trend in the purchase and sale of elementary components as opposed to whole manufactured systems. The individual elementary components may also have legitimate uses, dual-use goods, which have been described in its entirety by my colleague, making their identification for legitimate purposes even more problematic. Dual-use goods are difficult to identify, requiring specialist knowledge, and can be described in common terms with many uses. Networks through which proliferation-sensitive goods may be obtained tend to be complex. This, combined with the use of false documentation, allows for proliferation-sensitive goods, the entities involved, the associated financial transactions, and the ultimate end users to avoid detection. Front companies, agents, and other false end users are often used to cover up the ultimate end user. Risk of proliferation financing is more likely to be present in cases where the source of funds is illegal and the end user of the type of goods involved is obscured, making identification of such activities difficult.
Now, why should you be concerned with the prevention and detection of proliferation financing? Well, as we all know, proliferation and proliferation financing is a global problem that affects the population in a number of ways. It affects human life and livelihood because proliferation financing facilitates the movement, development, use, and testing of proliferation-sensitive goods. And this movement and development poses a threat to human life as they have both a short-term and long-term effect on a person's health and has resulted in the untimely death of millions of people. It affects the environment as these explosions cause pollutants in the air that can drop poisonous substances into the sea and cause death and damage to wildlife. It damages the economy as during these attacks, many buildings are destroyed and jobs are lost, which results in a decline in the economy. And this ultimately results in several people being unable to provide for the basic needs and millions of dollars having to be spent to rebuild. And it can affect your business. For example, a sample of publicized cases gives an indication of reputational damage, which may cause investors or customers to shy away from a jurisdiction perceived as accessible to proliferators. And lastly, becoming involved directly or indirectly in proliferation and proliferation financing can result in a business receiving fines, penalties, and facing more serious criminal charges. Now, what are the risks of proliferation financing? These can be categorized in three areas, which include threats, vulnerabilities, and risks. An example of a PF threat can be identified as a designated person or entity that has previously caused or has the potential to evade, breach, or exploit a failure to implement PF procedures in the past, the present, or the future. An area of vulnerability for proliferation financing includes those that can be exploited by the threat that may support or facilitate the breach on implementation or evasion of PF/TF laws. Effectively, it includes those factors that represent weaknesses in the business's counter-proliferation systems and controls, including financial products or type of services that may provide opportunities for designated persons and entities to raise or move funds or other assets for proliferation financing purposes. A risk is based primarily on a threat caused by the illicit use of products and services and exploitation of these products and services. Now let's look at a few red flags.
The following red flags are indicators aimed to assist in raising awareness of situations commonly encountered where there may be potential proliferation financing involved. The purpose of these red flags are to give you a broader perspective on the proliferation financing risks associated with customers, transactions and methods, and/or jurisdictions. First, let's examine some proliferation financing red flags that a business can look out for in relation to customers and its clients. The customer is involved in the supply, sale, delivery, or purchase of dual-use goods, which you've heard a lot of today, dual-use goods. Proliferation sensitive or military goods, particularly to higher risk jurisdictions. The customer or counterparty or its address is the same or similar to the one of the parties found on publicly available lists. An example of these lists, would be the sanctions list, and the agency as well as the FSC also sends out circulars with updates to these lists. The customer is a military or research body connected with a higher risk jurisdiction of proliferation concerns. Customer activity does not match the business profile. The customer is vague, particularly about end user and end use products. Provides incomplete information or is resistant to providing additional information when it's sought. If a customer is not willing to provide the relevant information to show the legitimacy of his or her activity or transaction, that should be carefully examined. Other red flags would be when a customer requests a letter of credit from a bank whilst awaiting approval of its accounts or establishing its business relationship. When a customer or client uses complicated structures to conceal its involvement, use of layered letters of credit from companies, intermediaries, and brokers. Give us 1 second, we have some trouble with the slides. Okay, here we are. Some transaction red flags include where the transaction concerns dual-use goods, proliferation sensitive or military goods, whether licensable or not. The transaction involves an individual or entity in a foreign country of proliferation concern. The transaction demonstrates a link between representatives of companies exchanging goods, for example, same owners or management, in order to evade scrutiny of the goods being exchanged. The transaction involves a shipment of goods inconsistent with normal geographic trade patterns. Example, where the country involved does not normally export or import the types of goods in question. Order for goods is placed by firms or individuals from foreign countries other than the country of the stated end user. Transaction involves an individual or entity in a sanctioned country. Transactions involves shipment of goods incompatible with the technical level of the country to which it is being shipped. For example, a semiconductor manufacturing equipment being shipped to a country that has no electronic industries. Now, some red flags related to geographic location. In terms of geographic location, some notable red flags are transactions involving a sanctioned individual, entity, or country, countries with weak financial safeguards and which are actively engaged with a sanctioned country, a presence of an industry that produces dual-use goods, proliferation-sensitive items, or military goods, deliberate insertion of extra links into the supply chain, for example, diverting shipments to third-party countries. Finally, we'll take a look at some other red flags you can pay attention for. Other notable proliferation financing red flags include the financial destination of the product or service or end user is unclear. Project financing and complex loans, where there's a presence of other objective factors such as an unidentified end user. Declared value of shipment undervalued in relation to the shipping costs. Inconsistencies in information contained in trade documents and financial flows. Example, names, addresses, final destinations. Use of fraudulent documents and identities. Example, false end user certificates and forged export or re-export certificates. Use of facilitators to ensure that the transfer of goods avoid inspection. Customer activity does not match the business profile. All the red flags mentioned here today are a non-exhaustive list and are for additional information. For additional information, please feel free to visit the agency's website as well as to do additional research into the topic. It should also be noted that these red flag indicators are not a definitive indication that proliferation financing is occurring, but serves as a basis for what measures a business may implement to detect it. It is crucial and good practice that adequate measures are implemented to mitigate the risk of proliferation and proliferation financing, as well as to deter it.
So now that we have talked about what a business should look out for in relation to proliferation financing, let's now see how a business can mitigate any proliferation financing risks they might become exposed to. Now, considering that proliferation financing is a highlighted problem for major financial centers, including the BVM, it is important for financial institutions, the NFPPs, and MPOs to develop robust PF standards and enforce routines to lessen systemic exposure, as well as include counter-proliferation financing considerations in the following areas. You want to establish internal controls. This can be done through having a compliance manual that includes your business's policies, procedures, and processes as it relates to proliferation financing legislative requirements. You also want to conduct client and business risk assessments. This entails conducting a business and/or institutional risk assessments to identify areas of your business that might be more susceptible to proliferation financing. Also, you want to perform customer risk assessments as these can aid in preventing customers who are trying to become involved in proliferation financing by allowing you to identify them and cease doing business with them and filing a report. You want to know your customer. Now, this involves collecting all the appropriate due diligence information for all customers, specifically those deemed to be of high risk. Establish reporting procedures. This is crucial as your business should establish both internal as well as external reporting procedures to report any suspicious activity or transaction that might be linked to proliferation financing. Train your employees as this would be the best way to provide knowledge required to identify any potential proliferation financing red flags. You want to also monitor your business's transactions on an ongoing basis to be able to identify any changes in your customers' behavior, their transaction history, and business activities. And lastly, develop situational awareness around various sanctions regimes. For example, the United Nations or OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and other sanctions lists, as you should establish sanction reporting agencies and policies and processes and procedures within your organization. So what are some key takeaways that we want you to leave with in conclusion? From this presentation today, we want you to be able to, we hope you'll be able to identify and disrupt the financing of weapons of mass destruction. These are important tools for combating proliferation financing of weapons of mass destruction goods and materials on a global scale. Financial institutions, DNFEPs, and NPOs can play a role in identifying proliferation financing related financial transactions. This can be done by reporting suspicious activities and transactions to your money laundering reporting officer and to the FIA. By establishing AML, CFT, and CPF internal processes, policies, and procedures within your office, this has the potential to contribute to maintaining international peace and security, as well as also prevent reputational damage to your business and the territory as its status as a premier financial center. So what do you do next? You want to visit the website at www.fiabvi.bg to find sector-specific AML, CFT, CPF guidance notes. You want to review the guidance notes on proliferation financing and review AML, TF code of practice, the AML regulations, and other relevant legislation to know your obligations. You also want to consider updating training for your organization, and you want to sign up for upcoming webinars. Now, we'll give you a few moments to ask any questions that you may have. And we know that proliferation financing is a heavy topic, but if you do have questions, we'll allow you to drop them in the question box and we'll be happy to answer them. Okay, we have some questions coming in. Can you do background checks against proliferation financing?
That's a very interesting question, but you actually can in relation to persons who have been suspected or alleged of doing so. So it would be best to check the media, check the media itself, and also to check the relevant list, the UN list, the OFAC list, and even the list we publish here in the territory to see if persons or designated persons match any names that come up on your radar.
Thank you. All those are the questions that we have coming in. I want to thank you for viewing this webinar on proliferation financing. I'm Timothy Hughes, and with me again who was facilitating this discussion is Deputy Director for Supervision and Enforcement for the Financial Investigation Agency. Thank you for tuning in.